depths of time, in ages when the world had yet to know humanity, there were laws accepted as unshakable. The land was solid, a shelter, a home. Water, however, was changeable, dangerous, suffocating. Land was the realm of life, water the realm of uncertainty. But history keeps in the darkest corner of its memory that unique and terrible moment when all laws reversed for an instant, when land became hell and water the only refuge. This is the story of the only time water was safer than land. Everything was as it should be. The sun filtered through the leaves of massive ferns and monumental trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air was filled with the heavy, rich scent of decaying plants, moist earth, and a distant swamp. This was a world that had been beating to its own rhythm for millions of years. Mornings began with a small, furry creature stepping cautiously from its burrow, just as its ancestors had done for millions of generations. It had no name. For the age when names were needed had not yet come. It was simply one of countless beings that existed, trying to survive. It was a mammal ancestor that hunted at night and hid during the day. Its body was small enough to fit in a human's palm, and this smallness was its greatest weapon. Living in the shadow of giants required being invisible, moving silently, and knowing every crack in the earth, every root hollow. Its days were spent searching for food. Insects, fallen fruits, the occasional bird egg it found were a feast for it. Every crack, every rustle of leaves meant potential danger. Heavy footsteps from afar, shaking the ground, heralded the approach of the forest's king, a massive herbivore. Then the only thing to do was take refuge in the nearest hole, hold its breath, and wait for the danger to pass. The sharp cries of small, feathered, intelligent hunters nearby were equally frightening. They were fast, hunted in groups, and could catch even the smallest mammal in a moment of inattention. The land was filled with these familiar dangers, but these dangers were part of the world's immutable order. The rules were clear. Hide, wait, survive. The river was a wide, slow-moving body of water that snaked through the forest. It was another danger zone. The water's edges were where massive crocodile-like reptiles lay in ambush. Even drinking water carried the risk of becoming victim to a jaw that could lunge from the water's depths at any moment. The water itself was suffocating, cold, and merciless for its small body. That's why land, despite all its predators, was the only refuge it knew. Land was mother. It fed. It protected. This seemed a fundamental truth of the universe. As certain as the rising and setting of the sun, the cycle of seasons, the eternal dance of prey and predator, that day had begun no different from the others. The small creature emerged from its nest among the roots of a tree. It sniffed the air with its sensitive nose and plunged into the dim depths of the forest to survive another day under the immutable rules of the world it knew, as always. It wasn't yet aware, but very little time remained before everything it knew and trusted would be fundamentally shaken. For that moment, the world was stable, the rules were certain, and land was the safest harbor. Life's monotonous rhythm began to be disrupted by small, barely noticeable abnormalities. The first sign was in the sky. Among the countless stars at night, a new one had appeared that had never been there before. Unlike the others, it didn't twinkle but shone with a steady, determined light. It grew brighter each night. It seemed like a small hole opening in the velvet of the sky, a light seeping through, growing larger. The small mammal didn't possess the consciousness to notice this change. For it, the sky only represented the darkness of night and the cycles of the moon. However, the forest's other inhabitants, especially the larger ones with perhaps more primitive instincts, had begun showing signs of unease. The small predators that hunted at night were making louder, more nervous cries than normal. The herds of herbivorous giants were panicking at the slightest sound, running meaninglessly back and forth with noises that made the forest groan. There was a tension in the air that couldn't be expressed in words, but that all living things felt. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something unknown approaching. As days passed, that alien light in the sky could now be discerned not only at night but in twilight, and sometimes even faintly at midday. It wasn't like a star. It was a pinpoint of light, but disturbingly bright. The oddities in animal behavior were also increasing. Some bird species had begun mass migrations, despite it not being their season, filling the sky with chaotic flocks. Even the river's giant inhabitants were restless. The massive reptiles that normally lay motionless underwater for hours were now being seen more frequently on the water's surface, thrashing the water meaninglessly. For the small mammal, life had become harder. The danger of being crushed under the feet of panicking giants had increased. Predators had become more unpredictable and aggressive. Each departure from its burrow to find food carried greater risk. Still, its instincts told it to hide, to retreat deeper, to take refuge in the more protected layers of the earth. Land was still its fortress. No matter what happened in the sky, the darkness and silence underground remained unchanged. One evening as the sun set, the sky took on strange colors. Blood red and sickly purple hues replaced the normal orange and pink tones, and that alien light was now more like a small disk than a dot. Even with the naked eye, it could be seen to have a shape. That night, a deep silence prevailed in the forest. Not an insect sound, not a nightbird's cry, only the wind's howl among the leaves and all living things' collective silent waiting. No one knew what was approaching, but there was a primitive knowledge coded into every creature's DNA that it wasn't a good thing. The small mammal stood at the entrance to its burrow, looking at that strange, bright star. Somewhere inside, a fear it couldn't understand was growing. This wasn't like the fear felt from a predator. This was a fear about the world itself. As if something in the fabric of the universe was tearing, and through that tear, something not belonging to this world was seeping in. The signs in the sky had now begun to be felt on Earth as well. At first they were faint, barely perceptible tremors, like vibrations caused by the footsteps of a massive creature walking very far away. But these tremors had no rhythm. They came at irregular intervals, shaking the ground momentarily, then disappearing. The small mammal felt these tremors more distinctly in the depths of its burrow. Land had always been the most solid, most reliable thing for it. Now this most basic sense of security was being shaken. The tremors became more frequent and intensified over time. They were no longer just felt, but also heard. A muffled rumble from the depths of the earth, unlike anything heard before, accompanying the tremors. This sound was like neither thunder nor an animal's roar. It was more like a moan from the world's internal organs. The panic atmosphere in the forest had now given way to a kind of numb horror. The animals seemed to have sensed there was nowhere to flee. The great herbivore herds had gathered in the forest's clearings, restlessly turning in place. Even the predators had stopped hunting, crouching as if listening to the sky and earth, waiting. The eternal cycle of hunt and hunter had been suspended in the face of a greater and more incomprehensible threat. In the river, too, the situation was no different. The water churned meaninglessly, small waves hitting the shores. Sometimes in the middle of the water, large bubbles appeared and burst as if something were pushing from below. The aquatic life had also taken its share of this abnormality. Schools of fish swam frantically near the surface, fleeing from depths they would normally never leave. The small mammal began spending more and more time in its burrow. The outside world had ceased to be that world whose rules it knew and had memorized. With each tremor, small pieces of earth fell from the ceiling of its burrow. This was the most frightening thing for it. Land itself, its fortress and refuge, was becoming unreliable. One day, the most violent of the tremors occurred. It was midday. Suddenly, the ground began to shake as if being shaken by a giant hand. Trees swayed wildly, branches breaking and falling to the ground. The small mammal was thrown back and forth inside its burrow. From outside rose a chorus of panic screams filling the forest. The anguished bellows of massive animals mixed with the shrill cries of smaller ones. The tremor lasted several minutes, but felt like a lifetime. When it stopped, the forest was unrecognizable. Many trees had fallen. Massive cracks had formed in the forest floor. A thick cloud of dust filled the air. That day, for the first time, the idea occurred to the small mammal that being underground might also have an end. If the ground continued to shake like this, its burrow could collapse on top of it. Land could become its grave instead of protecting it. This was the collapse of the most fundamental assumption in its world. After this tremor, the rumble from the Earth's depths never stopped. A constant low-frequency hum became the new background music of life. The alien light in the sky now resembled a small second sun more than a disk, and its presence had upset the world's balance. Everyone, every living thing, knew the inevitable was approaching, but no one could guess what it was or when it would come. The waiting was as terrible as the disaster itself. The moment just before the catastrophe was strangely calm, as if the world had taken a deep breath before the final and greatest blow. The Earth's tremors had stopped. The rumble from the depths had ceased. The sky had turned a sickly yellow-gray color, and the air was heavy and motionless as if electrically charged. Even the wind wasn't blowing. The leaves weren't moving. This silence was different from the forest's normal silence. Not a living, life-filled silence. It was a deadly, all-consuming void. The insects had fallen silent. Birds weren't singing. The animal sounds from afar had completely stopped, as if all life had been strangled by an invisible hand. The small mammal watched this eerie calm from the entrance to its burrow. Its instincts were screaming. This silence was like the silence before a storm, but it heralded a storm trillions of times greater. That thing in the sky was now frighteningly large. Even beneath the sun's brightness, it could be clearly seen. A glowing halo had formed around it from friction in the upper layers of the atmosphere. It no longer looked like a celestial body, but like a wound piercing the sky. The other creatures in the forest were also aware of this final moment. The giant herbivores stood motionless like statues, with their heads turned to the sky. The predators had forgotten their prey and were also staring upward in the same hypnotized state. In that moment, the enmities among all the forest's inhabitants, their struggles for survival, had lost meaning. They had all united at the threshold of a common fate, before the same unknown force. The air began to heat up. But this wasn't like the sun's normal warmth. It was a dry, scorching heat, as if the door of a massive furnace had been opened. The small mammal's furry skin was burning. Breathing had become difficult. The atmosphere itself seemed to be crushed under pressure. Then a very faint sound was heard. A high-frequency, ear-scratching thin whistle gradually rose and intensified. This was the friction sound of the approaching thing in the atmosphere. The whistle turned into an unbearable scream. The small mammal covered its ears in pain and tried to flee to the deepest part of its burrow. But there was no escape from the sound. The sound passed through the earth, through the marrow of its bones. In that moment, time slowed down. Everything seemed to be happening in slow motion. That object in the sky was no longer just a disk, but like a world in itself where craters and mountains on its surface could be distinguished. Its size was incomprehensible. It seemed to stretch from one end of the horizon to the other, and then the sound suddenly stopped. Everything stopped. Heat, sound, movement. A moment of absolute universal silence. Not a breath, not a heartbeat. The whole world had frozen while waiting for its own end. The small mammal had gone rigid with fear in the darkness of its burrow. Its heart was pounding as if it would break through its ribcage. It knew this silence was the beginning of the apocalypse about to break. The land beneath its feet, that safe refuge, would not be able to protect it from what was about to happen. And in that moment of absolute silence, the final seconds of the world as it knew it were being lived. What tore the silence wasn't a sound. It was a light. At the horizon, at the point where that stranger in the sky touched, the universe itself was painted white for an instant. Thousands, millions of times brighter than the sun. A blinding, all-consuming whiteness. This light instantly vaporized shadows. It left a dark silhouette etched into the ground behind every tree, every leaf, every living thing, and then erased those silhouettes too. The light was so intense it seemed to pass through solid objects. The small mammal felt this light in the depths of its burrow, even though its eyes were closed, as if its bones were glowing. This lasted a moment that felt like an eternity. Then the light disappeared, but darkness didn't come. Instead, everything was enveloped in silence in orange, then red, then the deepest color of fire. At the point of impact, a massive fireball began rising silently above the horizon, growing. It was like a mushroom cloud, but much larger, much more terrible. It expanded wide enough to swallow continents. And still there was no sound. The world had turned into a silent, mute film. There were only images. The rising fireball turned the sky into a furnace. The upper layers of the atmosphere ignited instantly. The sky was no longer a blue dome but a burning hell. This silent horror ended seconds later. The shock wave came. This wasn't a sound wave. This was a solid wall advancing across the planet's surface. The air itself visibly buckled, crashing over the forest at dozens of times the speed of sound. Before the shockwave, the forest was instantly flattened. Massive trees weighing millions of tons shattered like matchsticks. They were uprooted and blown into the air. Rocks turned to dust. The upper layer of soil was peeled off and thrown by a giant hand. The roots and earth above the small mammal's burrow vanished in an instant. The burrow was exposed for a moment, and in that moment, the small creature saw the apocalypse outside. The burning sky, the fragmenting forest, the bodies of massive animals flying through the air. Then the shockwave hit it too. It didn't kill it. It just hurled it into the darkness of unconsciousness. The rest of its burrow collapsed on top of it. It buried it under tons of earth. After the shockwave passed, the sound came. This was the combination of every imaginable sound, like billions of nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. The sound of the Earth's crust cracking, of continents shifting. This sound was so violent, it didn't just burst the eardrums of living things. It shredded internal organs. Everything exposed to the sound died instantly. But the small mammal, several meters underground in its unconscious state, was somehow protected from this sound. The pressure and noise created by the shockwave circled the planet multiple times. The world was echoing its own death cry. And this was just the beginning. The real horror was just starting. The sky had split open. Hell had descended to Earth. Land was no longer a refuge, but a sacrificial altar. Consciousness returned slowly and painfully. The first thing the small mammal felt was crushing pressure and suffocating heat. When it opened its eyes, all it saw was absolute darkness. It was trapped beneath the earth and roots that had collapsed on top of it. The air was filled with dust and the smell of burning. Breathing was nearly impossible. It began thrashing in panic, its claws desperately digging at the earth. Its luck held. It managed to move a loose pile of earth and create a small space for movement. It began climbing upward. It didn't know where it was going. All it knew was that there was air above, and it needed to reach there to survive. After hours, perhaps a day of struggle, its claws hit emptiness. When it pulled its head out, the landscape it saw didn't belong to the world it knew. It was night, but the sky wasn't dark. It was illuminated with an ominous red glow seeping through ash-colored clouds. There was no sun, no moon, no stars. Only this bloody glow. And something was falling from the sky. Like snow, but hot, fiery. These were billions of tiny rock fragments that had been hurled into space by the impact and were now returning to the atmosphere, burning. Glassified sand grains, molten rock droplets, small meteors. The sky was raining fire over the entire planet. The earth was unrecognizable. The forest was gone. Not a single standing tree remained. Everything was covered with charred, carbonized stumps and debris scattered over kilometers. The ground was covered with a hot layer of ash. The air smelled of sulfur and burnt flesh. In the distance, in every direction on the horizon, the glow of massive fires burning ceaselessly could be seen. The small mammal looked for a place to hide, but there was no place to hide. The root hollows, cavities, holes it used to take refuge in had all disappeared. It was completely defenseless in the open terrain. The hot particles raining down on it were burning its fur, leaving small burns on its skin. Its instincts told it to move. But where? Every direction offered the same hellish landscape. It began running desperately. The ash beneath its feet was hot and soft. With each step, a small cloud of dust rose. Around it, it saw the remains of other creatures. Charred, unrecognizable bodies. The skeletons of giants that had once been the forest's kings, frozen in strange positions, instantly cooked by the firestorm. To pause even for a moment in this landscape meant death. It had to keep moving constantly, somehow protect itself from the fiery rain falling on it. It tried to take shelter under a rock, but the rock was too hot to touch. This was the most painful proof that land was no longer a refuge. The ground, that floor that used to be cool and safe, had now turned into an oven tray. Every inch radiated deadly heat. Even walking was painful. Its small claws were burning. This fire rain lasted for days, perhaps weeks. The sky never brightened. The world was trapped between twilight and a red glow. For the few creatures who managed to survive, this was the first and most merciless test of the new world. Land no longer supported life. Land was actively destroying life. And the small mammal was advancing on this burning, dying land, not knowing where to place its next step, driven only by the instinct to survive. When the fire rain slowly subsided, it was replaced by another nightmare. The thick black clouds covering the sky now began raining not fire, but fine, suffocating soot. This was ash and soot from forest fires around the planet, filling the upper layers of the atmosphere. It was covering everything like a gray shroud. The landscape had taken on a monochrome, gloomy appearance. No colors remained except shades of black and gray. The air was filled with a sharp chemical smell that made breathing even more difficult. The small mammal was trying to survive in this new world. Hunger and thirst had become its greatest enemies. There was nothing to eat. The insects were dead, the plants burned, the fruits evaporated. Water sources had either dried up or were covered with toxic ash. When it found a puddle, it would carefully part the ash layer on top and try to drink the water underneath. But the water tasted bitter and metallic. Its body had weakened. The energy that once made it agile and fast had been depleted. It could no longer run, only move forward with slow, exhausted steps. Nights were especially hard. While the temperature was scorching during the day, in the absence of sunlight, it dropped to freezing levels at night. There was no burrow to take shelter in to keep warm, no plant cover to protect it. To conserve body heat, it would curl up near a tree stump still burning from within, but face the danger of suffocating from smoke. This world beneath the ash was a silent and dead world. There were no longer any animal sounds or the wind's howl. Only the sound of its own breath and the rustle of ash beneath its feet could be heard. This absolute silence was as frightening as the fire rain. Loneliness had become universal and crushing. Was there anyone else alive besides itself? It didn't know the answer to this question, and was afraid to know. One day, while moving through the ash, it came upon something familiar. It had reached the bed of the river that once flowed through the forest, but the river was gone. The bed was covered with cracked, dried mud and a thick layer of ash. However, at the deepest point of the bed, a thin trickle of water was still continuing. It headed there with hope. The water was muddy and dirty, but at least it was wet. It stayed there for hours, slowly drinking water with the tip of its tongue. Some strength had returned to its body. It decided to follow the riverbed. Perhaps downstream, where the river widened, there might be more water, and perhaps something that had survived. This wasn't a plan, it was a hope. A desperate step taken in darkness. Land had betrayed it. The earth that fed it, protected it, was now a dead shell, leaving it hungry, thirsty, and defenseless. With each step, the ash beneath its feet was like a painful whisper reminding it of how alive, how rich a world had once existed. But that world was gone. All that remained was ash, and beneath this ash, a stubborn, tiny spark of life trying to survive. The sky began to cry. But this wasn't life-giving rain cleansing the earth. These were the planet's toxic tears. The billions of tons of sulfur and other chemicals the impact had hurled into the atmosphere had combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid droplets. Now this acid was returning to Earth as black, sticky rain. The raindrops hissed and burned where they fell. They opened small holes in the ash layer, eroding the burnt soil beneath. When they fell on the small mammal's fur, they caused searing pain, irritating its skin. There was nowhere to hide from this rain. Caves, rock hollows, tree cavities had all been destroyed. It was completely exposed to this chemical assault in the open terrain. As it moved along the riverbed, it saw the rain slowly beginning to fill the bed. But this wasn't water that could be drunk. The acidic rain was dissolving the ash and chemicals on the ground, making the water flowing in the riverbed even more toxic. The flowing water now looked like black, viscous mud, with foam forming at the edges. The small mammal had to choose between dying of thirst or dying by poisoning. It no longer ran from the rain. It was soaking wet everywhere anyway, and the pain had become constant and unbearable. All it could do was keep moving forward. This acid rain turned the landscape into an even more hellish state. The charred tree stumps slowly melted under the acid's effect, taking on strange, twisted shapes. Rocks changed color, their surfaces becoming smooth. The world was slowly dissolving in a chemical bath. For other creatures who might have managed to survive this period, this was also the beginning of the end. Plant seeds, even if they had survived the fire, could never sprout in this acidic soil. Small organisms on the surface were instantly destroyed. This rain was essentially sterilizing the planet's surface. The small mammal took shelter one night under the ribs of a toppled massive skeleton. The bones provided limited protection against the acid rain. There it waited, trembling and in pain, for this new torture of the world to subside. Its body had weakened. The energy that once made it agile and fast had been depleted. It could no longer run, only move forward with slow, exhausted steps. Nights were especially hard. While the temperature was scorching during the day, in the absence of sunlight, it dropped to freezing levels at night. There was no burrow to take shelter in to keep warm, no plant cover to protect it. To conserve body heat, it would curl up near a tree stump still burning from within, but faced the danger of suffocating from smoke. This world beneath the ash was a silent and dead world. There were no longer any animal sounds or the wind's howl. Only the sound of its own breath and the rustle of ash beneath its feet could be heard. This absolute silence was as frightening as the fire rain. Loneliness had become universal and crushing. Was there anyone else alive besides itself? It didn't know the answer to this question, and was afraid to know. The world around it was dying slowly and painfully. The soil was now not only burnt and covered with ash, but also poisoned. It had become a cursed terrain where nothing could grow, no creature could inhabit. Land wasn't just unsafe, it was actively eroding, destroying every form of life. In the midst of this chemical storm, the small mammal had only one thought in its mind: water, but clean water. Unpoisoned, life-giving water. This thought was the only thing driving it to persist stubbornly along the riverbed. Perhaps if it went far enough, if it reached where the river emptied into the sea, the massive body of water there could dilute this poison. This was an almost crazy hope. But hope was the only thing it had in this dead world. After days of exhausted journey, the riverbed began to widen and deepen. The air had changed. The sharp chemical smell of the interior lands had been replaced by a faint scent of salt and seaweed. This was a sign that the sea or a large lake was approaching. The small mammal staggered downhill with its last strength and finally saw it. Before it stretched a massive body of water extending to the horizon. This was an estuary where the river emptied into the sea. The sky was still leaden and gloomy, but the water's surface was creating a shimmering luminosity by reflecting this gloomy light. The landscape was still dead. The shores were filled with debris, charred tree trunks, and strange rock formations eroded by acid rain. But the water itself somehow seemed alive. The acid rain and ash had also affected the water here. There was a dirty layer on the surface, but the volume of water was so large that the poison seemed to have been greatly diluted. The small mammal cautiously approached the water. It tasted a drop with the tip of its tongue. The taste was still strange, bitter and salty. But it wasn't like the pure acid from the interior. It was a wetness its body had longed for. It stayed by the water's edge for hours and drank. Then it noticed movement in the water. Just below the surface, a school of small fish passed quickly. This was the first living movement it had seen in weeks. It couldn't believe its eyes. While land had died completely, there was still life inside the water. This was a revelation, a moment of enlightenment. In that moment, a new strategy formed in the most primitive corner of its brain. Land was covered with fire, ash, poison. Land was death. But water could be a refuge. It could protect from the fire falling on the surface, from the raining acid, from the freezing night cold. Water might harbor food. This was a thought contrary to its and its ancestors' millions of years of genetic coding. They were land animals. Water had always been a danger to be avoided, but the old rules no longer applied. The world had changed, and to survive, it too had to change. On the shore, it saw a large charred tree trunk drifting. Its hollowed interior looked like a kind of primitive canoe. It hesitated. Entering the water meant jumping into the unknown, but staying on land meant certain death. It had no other choice. Slowly it climbed onto the trunk. It clung to the bark with its claws. The trunk swayed unsteadily on the water. For a moment it was seized with fear, but then it looked at the land, that dead gray landscape. There was nothing there for it. No burrow to return to, no food to eat, no hole to hide in. It took a deep breath and pushed the trunk away from the shore with its claws. The trunk began to drift slowly with the current, toward open water, toward an uncertain future. In that moment, in that unique moment in history, for a land creature, water had become safer than land. This wasn't just one creature's struggle for survival. It was also proof of how life can find a way even in the most difficult conditions. The charred trunk was gliding slowly in the estuary. For the small mammal, this was a completely new world. There was no longer solid ground beneath its feet. Everything was in motion. The trunk swayed gently with the waves, rotating with the current. At first, it was frightening. It felt as if it would fall into the water and drown at any moment. But as hours passed, it began to get used to this new situation. By taking refuge in the trunk's hollows and cracks, it learned to protect itself from the wind and the splashing of water. This floating refuge offered it something it hadn't had on land for weeks: relative safety. Fine ash was still falling from the sky, but there were no longer fiery particles or acidic droplets. Being on the trunk isolated it somewhat from the ground's freezing cold. The water had a more stable temperature than the surrounding air. Most importantly, there was life here. Small fish and other aquatic creatures were swimming around the trunk. At first, it didn't know how to catch them, but hunger was the best teacher. It learned to wait patiently at the trunk's edge closest to the water. The first time it managed to catch a careless fish approaching the surface with a sudden claw strike was a great victory. Eating raw fish was contrary to its nature. But in this new world, it didn't have the luxury of being picky. This was the protein needed to survive. Days began to pass with this new rhythm. During the day, it hunted on the trunk, observed the surroundings. At night, it curled up in one of the hollows and slept. The landscape of the shore was slowly changing. As it drifted along the estuary, it could see more clearly how devastated the coastline was. Kilometers of burnt terrain, toppled tree skeletons, a silent and dead world. Sometimes it seemed to see movement on the shore. Another creature that had managed to survive, desperately searching for food. But they all looked weak and sickly. For those who stayed on land, life was a torture. Watching them from afar from its floating castle, it understood it had made the right decision. Water was merciless and an alien element, but it was also impartial. The fire that burned the land had evaporated water but couldn't destroy it. The acid that poisoned the land had been diluted in water. Land had been the direct target of the catastrophe. Water, however, had acted like a shock absorber. It had somewhat mitigated the worst effects. This was the fundamental reason why water was safer than land. Land was the realm of memories, trauma, death. Water was a void, a clean slate, a world without memory, living only the present moment. The small mammal was healing not just its body but its soul in this floating refuge. The trauma was slowly being left behind. It no longer had to be on alert every moment. Here on the trunk, there were no footsteps of giants, no ambushing predators, only the soothing sound of water, the rhythm of waves, and the simple fundamental struggle of survival. This wasn't paradise, but it was the first stop after hell, and for now, that was enough. Life on the floating trunk had entered a monotonous cycle: hunt, sleep, drift. But this monotony was a luxury compared to the constant fear of death on land. The current was carrying it slowly, but steadily toward the sea. As the salinity level increased, life in the water was also changing. River fish were beginning to be replaced by larger, stranger-looking sea creatures. This meant both new opportunities and new dangers. One day, a massive dark shadow passed by the trunk. It was a creature hundreds of times larger than itself, coming from the water's depths. For a moment, its heart almost stopped. Water had its own giants too, but this giant wasn't interested in it. It continued on its way in its own world and disappeared from view. This was an important lesson. The world beneath the water was a complex ecosystem with its own rules. It was just a visitor to this world, a small, insignificant part. This insignificance gave it a kind of freedom. On land, its smallness made it constant prey. Here it was too small to register on the giant's radar. During its journey, it also witnessed the disaster's traces in water. Sometimes massive islets consisting of ash and debris, stretching for kilometers, floated on the water's surface. These islets were filled with corpses of countless creatures that had entered the water to escape the fires but drowned. Charred trees, plant fragments, and dead animal bodies created a horrifying layer on the water's surface. These sights once again revealed the scale of the horror experienced on land. It had moved completely away from the shore. It now saw land only as a thin gray line on the horizon. This was both frightening and reassuring. The last connection with land was also breaking. It was no longer a land creature or a water creature. It was a traveler stuck in limbo between two worlds. The whispers of the current seemed to be constantly telling it something. The sound of waves, the howl of the wind, the sounds the water made when hitting the trunk. These were the language of the new world. A language that didn't need words or meanings, only felt. These sounds reminded it that it wasn't alone, that the universe still had a rhythm, a flow. One night, it noticed a change in the sky. A small tear had formed in the thick cloud layer covering the sky for months, and through that tear the light of a star shone for a moment. This wasn't like that false death-bringing star. This was a familiar, friendly light, a memory from the old world. In that moment, hope filled the small mammal. Perhaps the sky was clearing. Perhaps the sun would return one day. This thought gave it the strength to continue. It kept drifting. The trunk had become its home, shield, world. The current was its guide. It didn't know where it was going, but for the first time it felt that the future might not consist only of darkness and death. Perhaps at the end of this journey was a new beginning, a new land, a new home. It had no choice but to believe the current would take it there. When it reached the open sea, the water's character completely changed. The calm waters of the estuary were replaced by long and powerful ocean waves. The trunk was no longer swaying like a cradle. It was climbing to the top of massive waves, then rapidly descending. This was a new survival struggle. It had to use all its strength to hold tightly to the trunk, to prevent a giant wave from throwing it into the sea. Sleeping at night had become impossible. It had to be constantly alert, trying to keep its potentially capsizing refuge balanced at every moment. The dangers of this new environment were also different. The shadows beneath the water were now larger and more frequently seen. These were massive predators living in the ocean's depths, less affected by the catastrophe. Sometimes they would approach the trunk and examine it curiously, looking at it with their massive eyes. These moments meant breathtaking fear for the small mammal. It would stay motionless, hold its breath, and hope the predator would lose interest. Fortunately, a small, furry land creature like it didn't appear on these giants' normal prey menu. For them, it was nothing more than an object of curiosity. But this situation could change at any moment. Hunger could drive even the greatest predator to desperate actions. Hunting had also become more difficult. Catching small fish in the choppy sea was nearly impossible. As a food source, it began eating the small algae and shellfish clinging to the trunk. The taste was bad, but it was enough to keep it alive. Sometimes storms would break out. The sky would darken, the wind would become like a monster, and waves would reach the height of a mountain. In these moments, survival was entirely a matter of chance. It would take shelter in a hollow of the trunk and wait for nature's fury to subside. The trunk came to the brink of capsizing many times, but somehow always managed to stay upright. After these storms, the sea surface would generally be covered with debris. Other floating tree trunks, plant fragments, and sometimes the corpses of other creatures. After one storm, another trunk similar to its own passed nearby. On it was another small mammalian creature like itself. But it wasn't as lucky. It was dead, its body swaying with the waves. This sight deeply affected the small mammal. It understood it wasn't alone, but also how fragile it was. Surviving this journey was an exception, not a rule. It had escaped from land and escaped from death. But water also had its own deadly face. The safety here wasn't absolute but relative. Compared to the certain and quick death on land, water gave it a chance. Slow, requiring struggle, a chance that could be lost at any moment. But this was better than having no chance at all. The underwater shadows constantly reminded it of this truth. It was a small being living in the world of giants. The giants of land had disappeared, but the giants of water still reigned, and it was at their mercy. During its journey, it wasn't alone, at least not entirely. Over time, it realized the floating trunk wasn't just hosting it. Small crustaceans, algae, and other marine organisms had attached themselves to the underwater part of the trunk. The trunk had become a small mobile ecosystem in itself. These small creatures were its silent companions. It would watch them, observe their growth, their reproduction. They too had adapted to this new mobile home. This small ecosystem also provided it with an important food source. When it was hungry, it survived by eating these shellfish and algae. Sometimes seabirds would land on the trunk. These birds were among the few flying creatures who had managed to survive the catastrophe. They generally looked exhausted and thin. They would land on the trunk and rest for hours, then take wing again and fly toward the unknown. The small mammal was afraid of them, but the birds weren't interested in it. They too were casualties like itself. Between them was an unspoken understanding. Both had lost their old worlds. In this new empty ocean, they were searching for a refuge. These encounters were brief and silent, but they held great meaning for the small mammal. They reinforced the feeling that it wasn't completely alone in the universe. There were others. They too were struggling. They too were trying to survive. One day it gained a more permanent companion. A small lizard species had probably been thrown from another piece of debris onto the trunk during a storm. At first they were wary of each other. Both instinctively saw the other as a threat. But as days passed, this mistrust gave way to a kind of partnership. The trunk was big enough for both of them. Their hunting areas were different. While the mammal fed on the organisms on the trunk, the lizard hunted the rare insects that fell into the water or small flies that landed on the trunk. They got used to each other's presence. They weathered storms together, starved together, watched the changes in the sky together. They didn't talk, didn't communicate, but a bond had formed between them. These two creatures from two different species, from two different worlds, had united in a common fate. This silent companionship was very important for the small mammal's mental health. It protected it from the hopelessness and madness brought by loneliness. Now it had to survive not just for itself, but also for this small-scaled companion. This sense of responsibility gave it a new purpose. The trunk was no longer just a refuge, but also a shared home. In this home, one of the New World's first and strangest families had been formed. This was a family based not on blood ties, but on shared trauma and the struggle to survive. And in the middle of this dead ocean, this small family was living proof of how life could come together, even in the most unexpected conditions. Months, perhaps more than a year, had passed. The concept of time had been lost in the uncertain cycle of day and night, but something was changing. The thick black cloud layer covering the sky had begun to thin. It was no longer constantly in a state of twilight. During the day, the sky took on a brighter, more gray color. At night, more stars could be seen through the clouds. And then one day, that moment came. On the eastern horizon, a pale, weak light appeared through the clouds. This wasn't the red glow of fires. This was a softer, more natural light. It was the sun. For the first time in months, perhaps years, sunlight was reaching the earth. It was very weak. It was as if looking through thick fog. It didn't warm, only illuminated. But its very presence was a miracle. The small mammal and its lizard companion stood on the trunk and looked at this pale disk. Their eyes struggled to adjust to this light after the long darkness. But an indescribable feeling of relief and hope filled them. The sun's return was a sign that the atmosphere was slowly cleaning itself. The worst period, that long, dark, and cold period that could be called the impact winter, was coming to an end. With the sun's return, changes began to occur in the ocean as well. Plankton, whose numbers had decreased in the absence of light, began to multiply again. This was the foundation of the ocean's food chain. With the increase in plankton, the small fish that fed on them multiplied. With the multiplication of small fish, more food appeared for larger predators. The ocean was slowly reviving. For the small mammal, this meant hunting became easier. It no longer had to make do only with organisms attached to the trunk. It could catch schools of small fish playing around the trunk more often. Its body began to strengthen, slowly regaining the agility it once had. The sun's presence also had a great psychological impact. Constant darkness and gloom gave way to light and hope. The world no longer seemed like a dying place, but a healing place. This would be a long and slow process. The wound the planet had taken was deep, and its scars would remain forever. But life was trying to take hold again, drawing strength even from the weakest sunlight. Every morning, seeing the sun's pale face on the horizon became a reward for having survived the previous day and a reason to begin a new day. The small mammal was no longer just drifting. It had a purpose. It believed the sun was taking it somewhere. The currents moving in the direction where the sun rose would take it to a new land, a soil warmed by the sun, where life could begin again. This belief was the greatest force keeping it alive. The sun's pale return wasn't just an astronomical event, but also a promise that life would continue. With the sun's return, the horizon line became more clearly visible, and one day, something it had never seen before appeared in the distance to the west. A piece of land. But this wasn't a green and living land like the one it remembered from its old world. It was a bare silhouette rising on the horizon in shades of brown and gray. The current was slowly drifting the trunk in that direction. As days passed, the landmass grew. Details began to be discernible. Massive bare mountains, wide flat plains, but not a single tree, not a single green plant was visible. As it approached the shore, it understood more clearly how barren the landscape was. The beach was covered with black volcanic sand and strangely shaped rocks eroded by wind. There was no sign of life on land. This was a new world formed after the catastrophe, a world washed with fire and acid, then reshaped by wind and water. The small mammal was in doubt. For months it had dreamed of land to set foot on, but this wasn't a place like in its dreams. This place also looked dead, but the trunk kept pushing it toward shore. Finally, with a gentle jolt, the trunk settled on the beach. The journey was over. With trembling legs, it got off the trunk. For the first time in months, there was solid, unswaying ground beneath its feet. This was a strange feeling, and it took time to get used to. The lizard companion also followed it. Together, they took their first steps on this new and alien land. The air was dry, and the wind was constantly moving a fine layer of sand. Instinctively, they looked for a place to hide. A crevice between rocks offered them temporary shelter. From there, they began to examine their new surroundings. Land was indeed completely barren. No plants, no insects, only stone, sand, and wind. Surviving here would be at least as difficult as in the ocean. There was no food. The water source was uncertain, but land had one advantage: permanence. Here they weren't at the mercy of a storm. Here they could build a burrow, establish a territory. The constant movement and uncertainty of the ocean had given way to terrestrial stability. But this stability would be tested by hunger and thirst. The first day was spent looking for food. They walked along the coast, searching for seaweed and small shellfish thrown ashore by the waves. The ocean was still the most reliable food source. As they moved toward the interior, the landscape became even more hopeless. This was a new desert, a desert created by catastrophe, purged of life. The small mammal wondered for a moment if it had made the wrong decision. Perhaps it should have stayed in the ocean, but then the instinct to dig into the ground, to make a burrow, prevailed. It was a land creature. Its nature was calling it to the land. This barren land was a starting point, a difficult start, but still a start. Here it had moved from water's temporary safety to land's permanent struggle, and this struggle would determine its and its species' role in shaping the new world. In this barren land that was their new home, life was a merciless struggle. Days were spent searching for food on the shoreline and trying to find a water source in the interior. Finally, they found a small pool where rainwater had collected among a group of rocks. This became their lifeline. At night, they huddled together in a small hollow they had dug, protecting themselves from the wind and cold. The lizard, being cold-blooded, was more active during the day on the sun-warmed rocks. The small mammal moved more in the twilight and the cool of night. This difference prevented them from competing for the same resources, allowing their strange partnership to continue. The world was slowly continuing to heal. The sun was getting a little stronger every day. The sky was showing shades of blue more often, and one day that little miracle happened. Near the water pool, a small green shoot appeared among the cracks of the moist earth. This was the first green color they had seen in months, perhaps years. It was a fern sprout. This plant's spores had somehow survived the catastrophe, been carried by wind to this desolate island, and found the right conditions to take hold of life. The small mammal and lizard watched that small green leaf for hours. This was much more than just a plant. This was hope itself, proof that terrestrial life was returning, that the soil was beginning to give life again. That first fern was followed by others within weeks. Slowly, a small green oasis began to form around the water pool. These plants not only created a burst of color, but also laid the foundation for a new ecosystem. The plants held the soil together, allowed moisture to stay longer, and most importantly, they also attracted other life forms. Before long, the first insects appeared in this green area. Probably their eggs had been carried by birds or wind. The appearance of insects was a feast for the lizard. It also provided indirect benefit for the small mammal because the insects helped pollinate the plants, enabling them to spread faster. This small green pocket became the center of their world. They were no longer just surviving, they were also witnessing the rebirth of a world. Every new sprout, every new insect was a symbol of the planet's resilience. The soil was bringing out the life potential within that poisoned, burnt shell again. Land was slowly beginning to become a refuge again. The word safe was still too bold, but at least it was no longer just a desert. It was a place that harbored life, that promised a future. The small mammal never forgot the day it saw that first green shoot. That day it understood why it had given up the temporary safety water offered. Because water was only an escape, but land was a future. Difficult, requiring struggle, but a future that could be built. And that green shoot was the first cornerstone of this future. With the green oasis's growth, new residents began to come to the island. These were mostly seabirds. They were no longer just landing to rest, but beginning to nest here. The nests they built on the rocks brought new sound and liveliness to the island. The bird's presence was both a blessing and a burden for the small mammal and its companion. Birds fertilized the soil with the waste they left behind, helping the plants to flourish even more. Also, sometimes eggs or small chicks they dropped from their nests were a valuable protein source. However, they were also rivals. They shared the water pool, hunted insects, and some large predatory bird species posed a potential threat to the small mammal and lizard, so they had to be more careful and wary. One day, an even more surprising visitor came to the island. Another tree trunk washed ashore, but this trunk wasn't empty. On it was a group of large ant-like insects. These insects were another castaway colony that had managed to cross the ocean. When they landed, they quickly organized and began building a nest underground. These new neighbors completely changed the island's ecosystem. They aerated the soil, facilitating plant rooting. They cleaned the soil by consuming dead plant and animal remains. But at the same time, a silent competition for control of the island had also begun. The arrival of these new creatures taught the small mammal an important lesson. The world was being refilled. Survivors, wherever they were looking for new habitats and filling every gap they found. This was life's unstoppable force. Now this island wasn't just its and the lizard's home. This was a laboratory where different species came together, where new rules were being written. The giants of the old world were gone. Their absence had created a massive opportunity for small, resilient, and adaptable creatures. Ants, birds, lizard, mammal. They were all pioneers of this new world. A new balance was being established among them. Sometimes conflicts occurred. Sometimes unexpected partnerships were formed. For example, the small mammal learned to feed on the waste coming from the ants' nests. In return, the sounds it made when it noticed a predatory bird approaching the ants' nest warned the ants. This wasn't a conscious agreement, but it was a working system. The lonely and simple safety water offered had given way to land's complex social dynamics. Here, surviving no longer just meant hunting and hiding. It also meant learning to relate to other species, to compete, and to coexist in harmony. Land was becoming a community space again. Dangerous, unpredictable, but at the same time full of endless possibilities. The small mammal was content to be part of this new order. Loneliness was over. The struggle continued, but it was no longer alone in this struggle. As the new world was taking shape, the ghosts of the old were still around. On the shore, massive bones eroded by waves were silent witnesses to the giants that once walked this planet. The small mammal would sometimes wander among these bones, feeling awe at their incomprehensible size. These skeletons reminded it of how different the old world was, a world where power and size reigned. But that world had become a victim of its own magnitude. The largest, the strongest, were the most defenseless in the face of catastrophe. They couldn't find places to hide, couldn't secure the massive amounts of food they needed. Their extinction was like a lesson. The most important thing for survival wasn't power, but the ability to adapt. Sometimes violent storms would tear relics belonging to the old world from the sea bottom and wash them ashore. Shells of strange-shaped, now extinct sea creatures, burnt wood fragments, strange glassy rocks formed by the impact's effect. Each was like an echo of that fire day. These echoes also lived in the small mammal's mind. At night in its dreams, it still saw the burning sky, the explosion shaking the earth, the fire rain. These memories had become a part of it. They made it more cautious, more careful. It carried a primitive fear inside that everything could be turned upside down again at any moment. But now this fear didn't paralyze it. It had become a force that kept it alive. It was the survivor, the memory carrier. When it encountered other members of its species, which happened very rarely, perhaps other castaways from other islands, there would be a recognition between them. The traces of the same trauma in their eyes, the same deep vigilance in their behavior. They were children of the new world, but living with the ghosts of the old world. This memory connected them to each other. This wasn't just a burden of bad memories, but also a wisdom. They had seen firsthand how fragile the world was, knew how easily land could turn into hell. This knowledge made them more humble. They no longer took anything for granted. They accepted each rising sun, each drop of clean water, each green shoot as a gift. The giants of the old world had left behind only their bones. But the small mammal and those like it would leave behind a legacy, the wisdom of survival. This wisdom would be written into their genes, passed down through generations, and enable their future descendants to succeed in this new, changed world. Land was now not just a living space, but also an archive where memories and lessons were stored. And the most important lesson in this archive was this: even in the darkest times, a refuge can be found in the most unexpected places. And even after the greatest catastrophes, life finds a way and begins again. Years passed. The island was no longer barren terrain. Ferns and other pioneer plants had covered a large part of the island. A small forest had even begun to form. Birds, insects, and other small creatures had formed a complex ecosystem. The small mammal had grown old. Its fur had grayed, its movements had slowed. But it was wise. It knew every corner of the island, every danger, every opportunity. It was no longer alone. It had come together with other mammals who had managed to survive like itself, formed a small colony. They hunted together, defended their burrows together. The lizard companion had also aged. They no longer met as often. Each had joined their own species community. But that old bond between them still continued. Sometimes when they met on a rock, they would stop for a moment and look at each other, remembering that long, lonely ocean voyage, that silent companionship they had shared. This was an understanding that didn't need words. The small mammal had made itself a new burrow. This wasn't a simple hole like before the catastrophe. It was a complex system of interconnected tunnels and chambers beneath the earth. It was large enough to house its family and colony. This burrow was a symbol of the roots it had planted in this new world. It was no longer a castaway, a refugee. This was its home, and it had built this home with its claws, teeth, and determination. One evening, it sat at the entrance to its burrow and watched the setting sun. The sky was glowing with healthy colors of orange and purple. The sickly redness was gone. The air was clean. From afar could be heard the sound of the ocean and the sounds of night creatures from the new forest. The world had normalized again, but this wasn't the old world's normal. This was a new normal, a world without giants, where the small reigned, a quieter, calmer, perhaps wiser world. In that moment, its entire journey passed before its eyes. The burning forest, the fire rain, the toxic floods, the loneliness in the ocean, the storms, the underwater shadows, and then the first green shoot. New neighbors, the beginning of a new life. It thought about how water had saved it. In that terrible time, water really was safer than land. Water had been a temporary womb protecting it from fire, poison, and death. But just as a fetus can't stay in the womb forever, it couldn't stay in water forever either. No matter how dangerous land was, it was where life belonged. Water was an escape. Land was a home. The journey hadn't just taken it physically from one place to another. It had also changed it and its species. They had become more resilient, more intelligent, more adaptable. The catastrophe hadn't destroyed them. It had steeled them. And now they were ready to become masters of this new world. They were land creatures born from water. Time continued to flow like a river. The small mammal died in peace among its family and colony. But its story didn't die with it. Its survival struggle had been etched into its genes. Its descendants inherited that first pioneer who crossed the ocean's resilience and adaptability. Thousands, millions of years passed. The island was no longer an island. Changes in sea level had connected it with a larger continent. That small fern forest had given way to forests consisting of massive diverse trees. Birds, insects, reptiles, and mammals had evolved into countless new species, filling every corner of the planet. The world the giants had vacated had been refilled with the descendants of the small. The descendants of that small furry creature had now become the planet's dominant life form. They had taken on different shapes, different sizes. Some were herbivores, some carnivores. Some lived in trees, some underground, and some had returned to the water where their ancestors once took refuge, adapting to live in the oceans. But they all carried the common heritage of that handful of creatures that had passed through that great catastrophe, that great filter. That terrible event had reset the planet's biological clock, changed life's course forever. If that meteorite had never struck, the giants might have reigned forever. Mammals would have remained small nocturnal creatures always living in their shadow. But the catastrophe had been a beginning as much as an end. That brief, terrible moment when water was safer than land was the birth pang of a new world. That moment was the beginning of the small and adaptable's victory over the large and powerful. Today, 65 million years later, another species rules the planet. This species makes tools, builds cities, even looks at the stars and wonders about the place from which those meteorites that nearly destroyed its ancestors once came. This species is a very distant descendant of that small trembling mammal. And deep within, in the oldest spirals of its DNA, it still carries the whispers of that moment. The memory of that time when the earth burned, the sky fell, and the only refuge was water. This is the world's legacy. The story of renewal born from destruction, of beginning that comes even after the most absolute end. And the eternal proof of how water, even if only for a moment, could be safer than land. And so that terrible parenthesis in time closed. Land once again became the center of life and refuge. Water returned to its old role, that mysterious realm both life-giving and harboring dangers. But during that brief, horrific period, the fundamental rules of the universe had been turned upside down. That period showed that survival was not just about power, but about the ability to find unexpected refugees at unexpected moments. A land creature's taking refuge in water against all the instincts inherited from its ancestors was proof of life's most basic urge, the desire to continue at any cost. Events were forgotten, continents shifted, species went extinct, and new ones emerged. But the lesson of that moment was etched into the planet's memory. Sometimes the most solid ground slips from beneath your feet, and the most unreliable wave becomes the only raft that will save you.